I always knew I wasn't the master of my own story. From my very first breath, every gesture, every word, every sigh seemed to belong to someone else, to the crown, to tradition, to the future others had mapped out for me. I grew up surrounded by embroidered gowns, unspoken rules, and rehearsed smiles, where destiny wasn't a choice, but a narrow path laid out long before I learned to walk. And for so long, I accepted it. I swallowed every expectation like swallowing stones, believing their weight was a sign of honor, not imprisonment. But that day, as I crossed the gilded hall for yet another soulless event, something shifted. It took just a moment, a glance, an almost invisible exchange, and I felt the ground beneath my feet waver for the first time. It was him. Not a prince, not a noble draped in gilded pretensions. Just an ordinary man, with eyes too sincere for the world I lived in, and in that unguarded gaze, without pretense or armor, I saw myself. Not the princess molded by others' dreams, but the woman who silently had always yearned to be free. I kept walking, because that was what was expected of me. The exemplary daughter, the flawless figure, the perfect reflection of the lineage I represented. My lips smiled for courtiers and suitors. My posture remained impeccable under the weight of jewels that bound me more than they adorned. But inside, what pulsed wasn't pride, but conflict. For the first time, a crack appeared in the wall of certainties surrounding me. And in that crack, something unexpected bloomed. A silent, forbidden, yet inevitable desire to know a world where words weren't chosen, where gestures didn't need to be rehearsed, where love, if it existed, could be simple. I knew, with a clarity that hurt more than any crown of thorns, that the path ahead wasn't just about alliances and duties. Not now. Not after I had felt, even for a fleeting moment, what it was to be truly seen. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was a whim, a lapse of thought brought on by years of living within molds too tight. After all, what could there be beyond foolish curiosity? I repeated this to myself like a mantra as they dressed me for events, as I recited practiced lines to men who spoke of politics and power, as if love were just another bargaining chip. But it took only a moment of carelessness, a stolen thought, between a forced smile and a rehearsed toast, for his face to appear in my mind with an almost painful clarity. I didn't know his name, I didn't know his story, but I knew, with a certainty no etiquette could erase, that the glance we shared carried something more real than all the rings and titles that could be placed on my finger. I began to see him, from afar, discreetly, as if the universe, conspiring for or against me, ensured our paths crossed, tending the gardens, carrying crates to the castle kitchen, always there, on the margins of the world I inhabited, yet with a presence that seemed to fill the space between us in a way no one else noticed. Each time our eyes met, even for a second, my chest tightened with an unbearable mix of fear and hope. I knew nothing about him, but what I perceived was enough to unsettle me. There was honesty in his gestures, simplicity in his stance, a raw freedom in his smile that made me long with a force that frightened me, to cast off everything I carried on my shoulders and simply exist. But the more this feeling grew within me, the heavier reality became. Preparations for my betrothal announcement to the prince of a neighboring kingdom were in full swing. The discussions were endless. Alliances, treaties, fortunes united. They spoke of me as if I were a chess piece, a strategic move to ensure peace and power. No one asked what I felt, and perhaps until that moment, I had never truly asked myself. I was a princess. My role was to obey. But now, with the weight of that glance etched in my memory, with my heart beating out of rhythm every time I saw him, I knew my soul was beginning to rebel. Silently, but relentlessly, against the future they had designed for me. The official betrothal announcement loomed like an approaching storm. Every step within the castle, every whispered word among advisors and ladies-in-waiting seemed to draw with indelible ink the path I was meant to follow. There was no room for hesitation. The prince was perfect on paper, kind, polite, bearing, all the seals of approval my family required. And yet, at his side, I felt an absence that consumed me from within. It wasn't his fault. It was as if, the moment our destinies crossed, I ceased to be a whole person and became merely a fragment of what was expected of me. I smiled because it was expected. I agreed because it was polite. But inside, every false smile was a small betrayal of something beginning to scream silently in my chest. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the demands became unbearable. Dress fittings, rehearsals for the grand entrance, speeches I was to memorize as if they were my own truths. And amidst it all, him. Always on the margins, always on the boundary between what was permitted and what could never be. A stolen glance. In the corridors, a quick exchange of smiles as I pretended to study the floral arrangements. Small gestures that to outsiders meant nothing, but to me, they were everything. Each silent encounter was a rope pulling my soul toward a choice I still lacked the courage to make, but which I knew on some deep level was inevitable. On the eve of the announcement, alone in my chambers, I removed the heavy jewels I wore and faced my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see a princess ready to be crowned a future queen. I saw a prisoner. I saw a young woman trying to suffocate herself to fit into a life that didn't belong to her. And for the first time, I admitted aloud, even if only to the emptiness of the room, I don't want this life. I didn't want alliances forged in gold and empty promises. I wanted a love that didn't require masks. I wanted freedom. I wanted him, not out of rebellion, not out of whim, but because amidst everything imposed upon me, he was the only choice that made my heart truly beat. And that night, before I even knew how or when I knew, the life they expected me to accept was about to crumble. Because I, Marcella Beaumont, was no longer the docile princess they had molded. I was a woman about to choose, for the first time, her own destiny. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of my room, I knew I could no longer live between two worlds. The ceremony was scheduled for the end of the day, but within me, the decision had already been made, even though fear tried with cold claws to hold me back. Every step I took through the castle corridors that morning carried a different weight. I wasn't just walking to fulfill protocols. I was walking to rediscover who I was, to finally give myself the chance to live a life that was mine. The fear of disappointing my family, of dishonoring the blood in my veins, still pulsed in some corner of my conscience. But for the first time, that fear was small compared to the silent strength propelling me forward. When I saw him in the garden, as if fate, in its infinite kindness, had placed that moment before me, I knew I could no longer ignore it. He was kneeling among the flowers, hands dirty with soil, forehead sweaty from the simple, honest effort of work no one admired, but which sustained the beauty everyone praised. When he looked up and saw me standing there, motionless, clutching, my dress as if it were the only anchor keeping me from collapsing, something in his gaze shifted. There was no arrogance, no surprise, only a deep tenderness, a silent question that said, "Are you okay?" And without thinking, without calculating the consequences, I approached. The conversation that followed wasn't grand or theatrical. They were whispered words carried by the breeze and the scent of flowers, timid and trembling phrases, but laden with a truth I hadn't felt in a long time. I told him in disjointed fragments about what was expected of me, about the marriage, about the role imposed on me as if it were the only possible reality. He listened in silence, his eyes fixed on mine, as if each of my words were a fragile thread of life he held with utmost care. And when I finished, when my voice broke in the air and tears threatened to breach the wall of pride sustaining me, he simply extended his hand, dirty with soil, firm and honest, as if saying, without needing words, "You don't have to face this alone." It was in that moment, in that simple gesture, that I understood. Love isn't measured by the grandeur of acts, but by the purity of small gestures. I could have a throne, I could have a life of privileges, but with him I would have something that couldn't be bought or negotiated, truth. And in that moment, in the complicit silence that enveloped us, I knew that what was blossoming between us was stronger than any title the world could offer me. After that encounter in the garden, my soul seemed to carry a flame no one saw, but which consumed me from within. I returned to the gilded halls, to the cold, impeccable corridors, but something in me no longer belonged to that place. Every gesture, every rehearsed phrase I exchanged with the prince, kind, polite, suitable, sounded hollow to my own ears. I smiled outwardly, but inside I counted the minutes until I could escape, until I could be, once again, the woman I found among the flowers. A woman who loved, a woman who wanted to choose. My heart filled with guilt with every new glance exchanged with my mother, who dreamed of seeing her daughter crowned, with every word of approval from my father, who saw the marriage as the culmination of his political efforts. But guilt, though heavy, was no longer enough to break me. I had now tasted the flavor of freedom, and it was too sweet to forget. In the days that followed, our exchanges grew bolder, though no one noticed. A note hidden among library books, a quick meeting under the shade of a centuries-old tree, a flower left discreetly on my windowsill when no one was looking. They weren't passionate vows or grandiose promises. They were shared silences, exchanged presences, as if simply being in the same space was enough to strengthen what we were building, word by word, gesture by gesture. There was a simplicity in the love blossoming between us that disarmed me. It wasn't a love of palaces or contracts. It was a love of complicit glances, whispered laughter, small choices made in secret, and for me, it was everything. But the world around us wasn't blind. I began to sense changes in the air, more attentive glances, veiled questions, murmurs growing louder in the corridors. The news of my impending betrothal, meant to be a celebration, now felt like a sentence approaching with heavy steps. My parents looked at me with pride, but also with growing suspicion, as if they sensed the silent rebellion brewing within me, and the prince, perhaps noticing my distance, became more attentive, more present, but not in a way that made me feel alive, but in a way that made the walls close in even tighter around me. I knew I couldn't sustain that farce for long. Every forced smile was an open wound. Every gesture feigning loyalty to the destiny laid out for me was a betrayal of the woman now fighting to be born beneath the skin of the obedient princess. I stood before a cruel choice: fulfill my role and ensure the stability expected of me, or tear down the castle of expectations I carried on my shoulders and build with my own hands a new life. Fragile, uncertain, but mine. And with every new hidden encounter, every word exchanged in haste, I felt the answer pulse within me with a force no crown could silence. The day of the official announcement arrived like an inevitable sentence. The castle was overtaken by exuberant flowers, shimmering fabrics, expensive perfumes that seemed to try to mask the tension accumulating in every corner. Nobles and guests filled the halls with their best smiles and calculating eyes. I walked among them as if crossing a minefield, feeling each step brought me closer to destruction, or perhaps to liberation. Dressed in the attire chosen for me, I felt like a doll adorned for others' pleasure, suffocated in lace and jewels heavier than fear itself. The prince awaited me in the center of the hall, his impeccable smile frozen on his face, and all eyes turned to me, expecting only the formal confirmation of a union decided long before I learned what love was. As I advanced toward him, my heart pounded against my ribs as if trying to tear me from that place by force. My eyes scanned the hall, and among the indistinct faces, I found the only one that truly mattered. He was there. Not as a guest, not as part of the spectacle, but as a firm, silent presence, as real as the ground beneath my feet. Our gazes met. And in that instant, I knew that if I took one more step toward what was expected of me, I would lose myself forever. It wouldn't just be love I left behind. It would be the woman I had fought to set free. The court fell silent when I stopped a few meters from the prince. The master of ceremonies, ready to begin the speech, hesitated, and in that brief moment of uncertainty, I felt every eye weigh upon me. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. My body trembled, but my soul was steady. I took a deep breath, let the silence stretch like a sharpened blade, and then, with a voice clearer than I thought possible, I spoke. I refused. Not with scandal, not with tears, but with a serenity only those who have suffered the greatest. Loss can possess, the loss of fear. I said I wouldn't accept, that I couldn't, that I didn't want a life of alliances without love, a life where my heart was a bargaining chip. Shock swept the hall like a wave, whispers, protests, looks of disbelief. My parents seemed petrified. The prince held his smile for a second longer, as if not grasping the gravity of what had just happened. But I didn't need their approval, not anymore. My gaze, steady, found the only one who had truly seen me from the start. And in the emotional glint of his eyes, I found everything I needed to move forward, even if the path was uncertain. Fleeing the hall that night wasn't a theatrical act. It was a near physical necessity, as if the air inside had become toxic, too heavy to sustain any trace of who I was. I ran, not out of panic, but out of the urgency to live, the longing to seize, with my own hands, the freedom I had chosen at such a cost. The castle was left behind, with its empty grandeur and corridors steeped in dead expectations. My steps, now barefoot, crushed the wet grass as I crossed the gardens, guided only by the vivid memory of the only gaze that had ever truly held me. And he was there, as if he knew I would come. As if, from the moment our eyes first met, he knew our souls were walking toward each other inevitably. There were no grand words or pompous declarations. When we met in the middle of the night, under the silent sky, everything we needed to say was already etched in every beat of our hearts. He extended his hand in that same simple, true way, like someone offering the purest thing they have, their presence, their loyalty, their unarmored love. I didn't hesitate. I intertwined my fingers with his and knew, with a peace no wealth could ever give me, that this was my place. Not in gilded palaces, not among alliances forged in convenience, but in the small, immense space of two hearts that recognized each other without effort, without fear. The world around us could crumble. We knew we would face scorn, hardships, disapproving looks from all sides. I would lose privileges, titles, the comfortable security of a life planned for me before I was born. But none of that frightened me in that moment, because for the first time, every step I took was mine. For the first time, my life wasn't a script written by others' hands. It was my story, my choice, my hard-won freedom. And it was received with open arms by the one who loved me not for the crown on my head, but for the woman who had finally learned to belong to herself. Starting over was like learning to walk again. There were no luxuries, no comforts, just the hard earth beneath our feet and the need to trust each other day after day. Far from gilded walls, far from the heavy gazes of the court, life had a different rhythm, one made of simplicity, of small gestures that, to me, held a value no precious stone could surpass. Mornings began with the smell of wet earth and the sound of birds that before I had only heard as background music through the palace's closed windows. Now every note felt like a greeting to the silent miracle of being alive and free. We ate, worked side by side, hands dirty, faces tired, but hearts relieved. And in the midst of this bare, unadorned life, I discovered a happiness that felt more solid and real than any promise of a throne. There were hard days, of course. The weight of what I left behind, the memories of who I was taught to be, sometimes crept into moments of silence. Sometimes I woke startled, dreaming of the castle's cold corridors, of voices demanding I return to what I was. Sometimes the physical exhaustion was so great that I wondered if I had been foolish to trade gold for stones, but all it took was a glance at him, at the way he looked at me, respected my space, smiled with the kind of tenderness not learned at balls or audiences, and all doubts dissipated like mist in the sun. It was there, in the imperfect life we built together, that I found not just love but belonging. Little by little, the scars left by the past became less painful. Not because they were forgotten, but because they learned to coexist with the new scars. Those made of conscious choices, silent battles, victories only those with a broken heart could understand. We built our home with our own hands, brick by brick, wood by wood, and with every wall raised, I felt I was also rebuilding myself. Not as a princess, not as a fugitive, but as a whole woman who no longer needed crowns to know who she was. In moments of rest, sitting under the starry sky, sharing simple bread and cheap wine, there was a peace I never found at court banquets. It was in those moments when the world seemed to fit only in the distance between our bodies and the comfortable silence we shared, that I understood the true value of my choice. I hadn't just chosen love. I had chosen myself. With time, the voices that once echoed in my mind began to quiet. The stern faces, the judgmental looks, the memory of the life I left behind. All of it became distant, like a story belonging to someone else. I was no longer the princess shaped by obligation, nor the young woman suffocated by expectations. I was Marcella Beaumont, just Marcella. And that was more than enough. In every dawn that found us side by side, in every small victory won with the sweat of our hands, I felt I finally belonged somewhere, not because it was imposed on me, but because I chose it, with all the weight and freedom that choice carries. Life, with him, wasn't made of grandiose promises or fleeting glories. It was made of constancy, silent loyalty, love woven into the small gestures of daily life. It was in the way he touched my hand with reverence after a hard day, in how he prepared my favorite tea on cold nights, in the smile that lit up his face when he saw me return with baskets of fruit from the market. Small things, but they held everything I had always sought and that gilded halls could never give me. There were no crowns, no thrones, and yet every moment shared with him was more precious than any jewel that once shone on my head. Sometimes, sitting on the porch of our small house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of copper and pink, I caught myself smiling for no reason. It was in those moments that I understood, with sweet and undeniable clarity, that I had won, not against a kingdom, not against a family or a title, but against the fear of being who I truly was. Choosing love, choosing to be free, was the bravest act of my life. And in the end, I didn't need thrones or alliances to prove my worth. All I needed was the quiet sound of his laughter echoing in the night, and the serene certainty that, by following my own heart, I had finally found my home. Years passed, but there was never a single day I doubted the choice I made. Our home grew. With time, walls strengthened by our shared work, gardens that bloomed under our hands, and memories that piled up like treasures in every corner. Sometimes news from the old kingdom reached our ears like distant echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. I heard the prince married a lady of good lineage, that the court continued its rituals, as if my absence had been merely an inconvenient pause in its perfect routine. But for me, that world of soulless gold was now just an irrelevant detail in a greater story. Each day that dawns by his side deepens my understanding of what it means to love without shackles. Love that doesn't require masks, that doesn't weigh, that doesn't corrode. We choose each other every day, with the imperfections, the small struggles, the raw beauty of real life. When he holds my hand during dinner, when he smiles at me through the open window while working, when he hugs me unhurriedly after a long day, I see that there lies all the glory I once dreamed of, and much more. I didn't need applause or crowns. All I needed was courage, and it brought me home.